Thank you guys so much for continuing to follow me in our Seeing Through Gebser series. We're in part 2 of a provisional statement of account, measure, and mass. I have my Benny the Butcher shirt on, which is incredibly oversized. You guys should listen to the album Tana Talk 3. If West Baltimore sounded like music, that's what that would sound like. Listen to that. So we're going to continue, but I'm going to read the last paragraph that I left off in the last video just to establish some continuity. And I hope you guys are doing well. All right. It says the line of questioning pursued earlier that calls into question progress on the one hand, as well as any reattachment to the past on the other, both elicits and is elicited by anxiety. And to the extent that the problem is posed today in terms of alternatives, any unilateral solution is an illusion because it is temporally and mentally, even mentalistically, conditioned. The advocates of one solution adjust their sights to quantitative steps, advocates of the other place their hopes on unfathomable. But positive or negative, both sides are addicted to a mental rational conception of the world which is one-sidedly quantitative, dualistic, and fragmenting, as well as being transitory, a fact that only very few seem to consider. Now, before we get into the new stuff, I want to give a preface that we're going to be getting into some, I don't know what you want to call it, spiritual stuff, metaphysical stuff. The rationalists need to click off. This is not for you. And I don't know why you're watching because I've just deconstructed your worldview, man. But seriously, this is going to get very abstract, and this is going to get very esoteric and a little. It's not going to fit in your rationalist box, so you need to be prepared for that. Hopefully, I did a good enough job of, in all seriousness, deconstructing that so you can take this seriously. If not, go watch my Kill Rationalism videos. They are relevant here. He says, what is at stake here is neither a loss nor a gain, neither an ascent nor a descent, but a rearrangement or restructuration, a mutative unfolding that is both positive and negative in the terrestrial arena. In other words, in the space-time world where it appears and is fulfilled. So the rationalist argument of gains and loss, which signals a direction of, let's say, technology, that's deficient. We're not doing that. Again, in my last video, it's a restructuration of consciousness to reattain the spaceless timelessness of Magic Man. So we're already missing, we're already assigning a framework on that question that just misses it. But quote unquote outside this battlefield arena, scene, and proving ground, to the extent that we can even speak here in appropriate spatializing terms of an outside, is located that quote-unquote core, which is scarcely touched by terrestrial matters because it is itself only tangential to them. So terrestrial is Earth on the physical plane. The core is tangentially related. We're getting into the metaphysical plane. And this core, or nucleus, is in all likelihood identical to the presence of origin, and as such also forms, shapes, and directs each and every individual human being. So that's another thing that Gebser, he doesn't even try to tell you where these mutations come from, because I think he recognizes they don't come from any sort of terrestrial sphere. They don't come from this world. They come from a different world. They come from the core, the itself, the spiritual world, that, as he says, is tangentially related to our world. This core, to use our tentative designation so as to avoid such concepts as essence, essentiality, substance, superego, self, divine spark, and the like, we should like to describe more appropriately with the term the itself. The itself can become visible in the reflexivity, of the ego without succumbing to the autism of a quote-unquote self, and the psychic coloration inherent in the mystical divine spark, which shows its indebtedness to the psychic mythical structure by virtue of the fire spirit symbolism. So he says, between the ego and the itself exists the same degree of difference visible in the distinction between the expressions I see and to see oneself / itself. So I was going to show you my cat, but she doesn't want to. I see this, right? But I am seeing, that's very simple perception. But I see oneself or itself, myself, in the mirror. That's almost a self-consciousness. So that the distance between those two is the same distance between the ego, the sense of I, and the itself, that reality, unobscured by consciousness. This is accurate inasmuch as there is a dependence in a grammatical sense of the oneself and the ego or I, for the grammatical structure reflects inner data and events to which it gives expression. The fact that the grammatical structure is also a mirror of quote-unquote inner data serves to express and indicate that the ego, in order to function effectively in its sphere, is dependent on the itself. So what he's going to make the argument is that the ego and the itself should not be viewed as antithetical either or negations of one another. They are mutually complementary and corresponding to one another, symbiotic of one another, in the same way that I mentioned, I believe, in my last, I think I mentioned this in my postmodern video. The world of theory and the external world out there, the world out there and the world in here do not negate one another. They are not separate from one another. They rely on one another. They feed off one another. They are like the 2D circle. One cannot think without having some sort of external sense coming in from the world. I don't see how that's possible. I don't see how you could possibly do that. And theory, as we all learned when we watched the movie Oppenheimer, means nothing unless it is validated or has some sort of externalization or correspondence to the external world. That can be tenuous, that could be light. There has to be something. It's the same thing with the itself and the ego. The itself, well, we'll get there. I don't want to confuse you yet. Let's see. Where did I leave them? We can indeed discern here a possibility of mutation, a mutation from the hypertrophied ego consciousness that is today either submerged in the we non-consciousness of the masses, or hopelessly isolated in self-aggrandizement to a consciousness of the itself which relates not only to the ego but to every thou, to every it, and to every we. Not sure what he means by that. Regarded in this way, the itself is that which pervades or shines through. Remember, integral consciousness structure is the rendering transparent of the previous structures, integrating them into a unified holistic whole and assigning meaning to all of them. It's shining through. That's the key of integral consciousness. Diaphanous, we are rendering the world transparent. Transparent from what? We'll get there. This presence of origin, in itself pre-spatial and pre-temporal, not merely magically spaceless and timeless, remember, archaic, is pre-time, pre-space. Magic is spaceless and timeless. There's a big difference between those two. Anticipates by this pre-spatiality and pre-temporality the spaceless timelessness of magic in the same way that space-timelessness in turn, despite its apparent formlessness, anticipates space and time. So we have pre-space and pre-time, pre-spaceless, pre-temporal. That anticipates spacelessness and timelessness, which in turn anticipates space and time. So it's a very interesting sort of evolution here. Don't get too lost on that word, but progression here, where it's originally there's nothing, it's completely before that. But latent within the pre-space and pre-time origin, space, I don't want to say space, maybe, character, is the potentiality for not only spacelessness and timelessness, but space and time. So that's what's happening with the itself and the ego. The core, with the presence of origin, which again, I think Gebser is saying this is beyond the earthly realm. We're getting into areas that are beyond just here. Rationalists do not belong here. The itself, that core of origin, is able, and it also anticipates all of our consciousness structures and affects itself, makes itself known, renders itself transparent in the integral consciousness structure. The integral structure sees all the preceding structures, recognizes the limitations, and sees through them and recognizes that space, that origin, where spacelessness, time, or excuse me, pre-space, pre-time exists. It is a presence, it is a reality. It is in and by the human itself that the presence of origin which corresponds to it could become diaphanously visible. Let me try that again. It is in and by the human itself that the presence of origin which corresponds to it could become diaphanously visible. So we had origin in the archaic structure, then we had magic. Now, of course, the origin holds the latent potentiality for magic, mythical, mental. So we go through all those progressions, and then in the integral, origin, the itself, has been able to reify itself consciously. It was in a state of unconsciousness. Remember, archaic, there wasn't a ton of conscious complexity. There wasn't the way of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other, just wasn't there. Having said that, we were subsumed in that presence of origin, that mode of being. But now, after all the consciousness developments and structures, we are re-attaining that presence of origin consciously. That's the big difference. So the itself, through the unfolding of consciousness structures, has rendered itself visible consciously to man and through man. This rendering visible is perhaps the decisive element by which to, quote, bring about the quote unquote new, it would elicit or it would itself be the expression of the new mutation. And here we would again mention that the diaphanon, that which shines through, has nothing to do with things circumscribed by the mental terms essence, existence, substance, and the like, by such psychic phenomena as images of symbols of fire, the sun, the divine spark and light, or by magic expressions of any form of unity or identity. So it's not necessarily that state of unity that the Buddhists and the magical man attended. That's spaceless, timeless. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking pre-space, pre-time. And it has nothing to do with mental or mythical. Remember, actually, he's about to say it. All such concepts, images, and identities manage their limited pseudo-existence in each instance by rationalization, by their appeal to myth or to magical unity. Concepts in particular have their spatial limitations since they must proceed from a world of being, space, and thought, which makes them possible and which, in turn, is not only temporally but also spatially limited. I think that's where you get this idea that only certain cultures created certain ideas. So only the West, who was probably the first to latch on to the mental consciousness structure, and of course the hypertrophied ego, was the one who could come up with this idea of individual rights, separation of powers. You can very clearly see the rational dividing there. We're dividing the individual from the collective, and of course we're separating all these different functions of government and having them compete. They negate one another. And that's our political philosophy. And then you also see on the Eastern, you see this far greater respect for community and the we. There's a reason for that. The concepts and ideas and stuff are spatially limited. The diaphanon, then, cannot be classed either as a form of symbolism or as a methodology. It is neither psychic nor mental, nor does it bear the stamp of magic. So it's got nothing to do with the preceding consciousness structures necessarily. It's not that we've talked about so far. Rather, becoming co-visible in and through man, it attests to the new mutation by which all previous spatio-temporal unfoldings represented by the increments of dimensioning and consciousness are integrated and made quote-unquote meaningful. Repeat for emphasis. Rather, becoming co-visible in and through man, it attests to the new mutation by which all previous spatio-temporal unfoldings represented by the increments of dimensioning and consciousness are integrated and made meaningful. So it's pretty much what I just said. So the origin, the presence of origin, the experience, that mode of being, sort of, that has become co-visible and conscious and present in our man, and in doing so, we have taken the consciousness structures, their corresponding and complementary dimensioning that they use to reify the world, and we see through them now. And they're made meaningful. So this is why spirituality is coming back in modern days, because whether people like it or not, the integral structure, I think at least, is worming its way in. I think it's trying to mutate. It's incipient. But go look at a 3D versus 4D. I think I mentioned this in one of my other lectures. 3D, there's no space, or there is space, but there's nothing filling the space. The space is completely devoid of content or meaning, but a 4D fills that space. And of course, once we get the rationalists out of our way, now we've got meaning all over the world. Poetry is taken seriously again, mythology is taken seriously again, spirituality is taken seriously again. If I want to take poetry seriously, I'm not going to take a mental rational accounting to it. So what have I just done there? I'm going to take a mythical account. So what have I just done? I've recognized one of the consciousness structures, recognized what domain, okay, I'm reading poetry. This is a domain of life. Which structure should I use? Oh, I'm going to do the mythical consciousness structure because that's more conducive, and it's more in alignment with this domain of life. Now, if I'm doing science or history or mathematics, it would be foolish to start being irrational and start doing this sort of weird, no, the moon is actually the soul's death pole and the sun is the soul's life pole. Though on a mythical thing that makes sense, but in a scientific, that would be wholly foolish. You don't want to do that. Test a new mutation. But the fact that I'm even able to do that attests to a new mutation, the integral consciousness structure, where I have knowledge of these things, I have knowledge of these structures, and I'm able to deploy them whenever I want. And as these spatiotemporal unfoldings or exfoliations open the possibility for the conscious emergence of the presence of origin, this presence diaphanously enters the realm of conscious and visible effectiveness from its unconscious and invisible state. Okay, so the presence of origin, that spaceless timelessness, that was unconscious, but integral brings it to consciousness. It mutates in man himself. Or is it that he mutates in its quote unquote direction or from within the originary presence? It mutates in man from its pre-spatiality and pre-temporality to a space-free, time-free presence of origin that is manifest as an effectuality of the human itself. Now I wrote down on my notes. I said